Okay, the next topic is how to sort your array if you have an array. So if you want to reorder the elements in your list box according to alphabetical order, you can sort them using this method, the sort method applied to your array. So the way that you call it is you have to do array.sort, open bracket, and then close bracket with the array that you want to sort inside. So you can make a new button, and then inside that button you can clear the list. You can sort the array first, and then you can use the method that you defined called add items to list on that same array and see what the results are. It should be sorted. Okay, let's go through what he says here. All arrays are internally implemented in a class called system.array. In this case, you use a method called sort on that class. So what they mean is, they mean this here. You do array is the so-called class, and that class has a method called sort. So we haven't really studied the notion of classes and objects, so this probably is not that clear. But anyway, you have a class, and in that class you have a method, and this will sort arrays. So you can call this method called sort using this syntax here. The sort method takes a single parameter, one parameter, namely the array that you want to sort. The method then does what its name suggests, sorting it for you into an order appropriate to the data type of the array elements. So the data type here is strings, right? So it's going to sort it alphabetically. In this case, you are using a string array. So you get an alphanumeric sort, or alphabetic sort, actually. I guess it's alphanumeric because the strings could have numbers at the beginning. If you were to attempt to use this technique on an array containing integer or floating point values, the array would sort in numeric order. Okay, let's read this though. The capability to pass different parameter types in different calls to the same method and to get behavior that is appropriate to the parameter type actually passed is called method overloading. Okay, so that's a term from from object-oriented programming theory, and that's maybe one of the first words we've learned like that. It's called method overloading. So what is method overloading? You might think it's nothing, but it's that we, in this sort method, we can pass this thing, which is an array of string types, or we can pass it an array of integer types, and it will do something slightly different for each type, right? Because if it's string types, it'll sort it alphabetically, and if it's a numeric type, like an integer, it'll sort it numerically. So that doesn't sound like it's very much, but it's actually, when you're programming this method, you have to decide, for example, are you going to sort according to strings, or suppose you had to make this sort method. You would have to decide, are you going to sort as though things were strings or as though things were numbers? But this method will take whatever it gets. If it gets a string, it'll sort according to string, and it'll sort according if it's a numeric array, it'll sort according to a numeric sort, and so it does both. So it's really actually two methods, but they both have the same name. So and so we call it method. It's called method overloading. So you'll learn more about that if you take a more advanced programming course. So he says sort is referred to as an overloaded method. Okay, because you can put two different types of objects into it, string type array or numeric type array, or maybe other types as well. Okay, here's a way to go through the array in the reverse order. So we've been going through from the first element to the last, but you could go from the last element to the first. So he says there are two ways that we can do this. We can one is we could use the for next loop, not the for each next loop, but the original for next loop, to start at the upper index bound of the first dimension in the array. So what does he mean by the first dimension? Well, we've only talked about one dimensional array, so it's a little bit, I don't know why he said that. But anyway, and work your way to 0 using the step -1 keyword as shown in this example. So this is what you'd have to do. For this as integer in here, remember, for integer equals here to here. So what this does is it takes our array and it gets the highest value, the highest index of that array. So maybe there's 10 elements in the array. That means it would get, this would come to become 9. Remember, because if there are 10 elements, then the highest index is 9. So you'd go from 9 down to, right, because the step is -1. So if you don't remember this, you have to go back and review for loops, or for next loops. Okay? Anyway, so we're going to go from, for example, from 9 down to 0, stepping -1 each time, and this is our control variable, which goes into here. In other words, it goes into the array. And so we first time through the loop, this says this is equal to 9. So we're adding the 9th element. And then next time through the loop, this becomes 8. So we're adding the 8th element. And the next time through the loop, this becomes 7. So we're adding the 7th element, and so on. Or actually, I should say, the 7th, when it's 7, it's actually the 8th element. But anyway, I'll let you worry about that. So that's one way to do it. And so that's one way to go backwards through an array. There's another way. Instead of calling this, in the previous example we said array.sort, we can instead call the reverse method and apply it to our array, and that sorts in the opposite order. And then, now we've got our array sorted in the opposite order. Now if we add items to the list, they will be added in the opposite order. So there's a method called, instead of sort, there's a method called reverse. So instead of sorting, we might want to just take an array and switch the order of all the elements, so the first element becomes the last element, and the last element becomes the first element, and so on. So add this to your form, and add the code, or give it this, and this text property, and this code. Clear the list, and then do this stuff, and make sure that it works. Oh, and one more thing. He says, if you want to list your array in descending sorted order, what would you do? You would call the sort method first, and then call the reverse method afterwards. And that would put it in so-called descending order. Now, you probably remember that when we did dim statements before, we could not only declare something, for example, declare something as an integer or as a double or as a string, but at the same time we could give it a value. So you could do like dim int number as integer equals 27 or something like that. Right? We did that before. So you can also do the same kind of thing if you have an array, but in that case you have to fill up the whole array. You don't just say equals 27, because that would only fill up one piece of the array, one part of the array, one element of the array. So you have to fill them all in. So you could do this though. You could say dim, this is just like before, we are creating the array, and then if you want to give it its values right now instead of doing it later in the code, you can, but you have to do it like this, equals, and then you list the elements like that. So you have to use this kind of bracket and this kind of bracket again, and quotation, well, that's for strings, quotation marks, comma, quotation marks, comma. You don't have to have quotation marks. If it's integers, for example, you wouldn't have quotation marks, but you'd have comma, 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 comma. Okay, so now we've not only declared it, but we've given it values as well. That's called initializing it. Means you give it an initial set of values. Maybe you might change those values later, but you give it an initial set of values. It's called initializing the array. Okay, so after you have that array and you've initialized it, then you can use this method that we created, that we wrote, to add all of the elements in here to the list. Okay, so do this one as well. Create another button with this text and add this code and run it. So this time we didn't have to do this. Sorry. This. Before, we did something like this. We initialized the first value like that, the 0th value, and we initialized the next value like that, and like that, and like that. We did that before, but this time we don't do it that way. We do it all at the beginning when we're declaring the variable. So we initialize the array with values. So you can do it that way if you like. Let's read what he says. The pair of braces, these things here, allows you to set the values that should be held in the array directly. In this instance, you have 5 values to enter into the array, separated with commas. Note that when you do this, you don't specify the upper bound for the array. Instead, you use empty parentheses. So he means here. We're just using this as blank, or as empty parentheses. Instead, you just use empty parentheses. Visual Basic 2010 prefers to calculate the upper bound for you based on the values you supply. This technique can be quite awkward to use when populating large arrays, of course, because you'd have a long list here. If your program relies on populating large arrays, you might want to use the method illustrated earlier, specifying the positions and the values, like we just set up here, like that. This is especially true when populating an array with values that change at runtime. So when the user starts to run the program, if the arrays change, it's probably not, this might be awkward to have done it this way.